everybody. Welcome to our panel today. Thanks for joining us. It's late on the East Coast, but it's still relatively early here on the West Coast. I'm joined with Eric Lee here. I say Lee, I guess. Lie, which, either one. Okay.
Lee is the correct
Lee.
pronunciation. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. What we're going to get into a little bit is assessments. Generally a lot of work that people do to make sure that in this modern age, the candidates, the people that we are bringing to the table are who they say they are. Talk a little bit about that. I had a little tagline about assessments that, like instant replay and value, I guess, video assist refereeing, and for those Europeans here of us in sports, everybody likes to complain about it, but the bottom line is we all believe that it's the right thing and everybody wants the right call. So here we go. I will kind of progress and set things up a little bit. Let's see. Computer both just can't connect. Okay. That was Jim who's joining us. Okay. Yeah, he will be hopefully joined with Jim here shortly. And as far as the other panelist, Dan, he unfortunately let me know earlier today that he won't be able to make it. He took ill over the weekend, has been trying to combat what I think a lot of us are facing, and is just really in bed, not feeling very well, and apologized profusely for not making it, but he didn't feel he was going to be very productive or contributing a lot here today under the illness. So we're going to move right along. So we're the assessment group here as part of the World Staffing Summit. What is important to the theme of this year's summit is client experience. So we're going to try to focus on that some. So I put a few slides together to kind of frame the conversation today. And one of them is this big picture slide where, what are we talking about here? We obviously know that there are a lot of candidates out there looking for a position. A client is asking for help, wants to recruit someone, very often with a supply chain of staffing companies to basically advise and provide those candidates. In a more sophisticated world, that sort of commerce, that activity, is packaged in some form of contingent workforce program, perhaps that the client is part of a large enough company, a corporate, and going by the three-letter acronyms of MSP programs, contingent workforce programs, and essentially they organize the process of taking that information, those candidates submit the recs, and go further than that. But for the recruiting side of it, they really sort of draw in the supply chain to bring people in. Our panelist today, Jim, hopefully will be joining us here shortly. He is president of the Pinnacle Group, which is a large IT services companies with some major clients, and is also operating contingent workforce programs for those large clients. So very professional. We're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars of spend being managed on behalf of these clients. And Jim will kind of give us some viewpoints, hopefully, in that. I've worked with him for a long time in these types of areas and was an original founder of VMS technology back in the early 2000s with another company that I was CEO of called eWork. eWork went on to grow up to be a big company in Europe and does a lot of vendor management system and assisting large clients with the whole supply chain of workforce. Now I'm presently the CEO of eTechie, which is an interviewing as a service type company. Dan, who unfortunately can't make it, is the CEO of another interviewing, what they like to call simulation interviewing. And I'll let Eric speak for himself. He's here today too. So Eric, maybe perhaps you can give us a little introduction to you.
Thanks a lot, Hans. KarmaCheck is a company that is working in the exciting space of background checks. And it could be very exciting. We're trying to bring kind of a new way of doing background checks to the world. And, we're very excited about it. Happy to tell you more as we go on in the session.
Thank you. The reason for the way this diagram looks is I wanted to really sort of provide the understanding that we typically are helping, let's say, the supply of all these candidates make their way to the right jobs and the right clients. And the bottom line is that we're in between. We get a lot of exposure to what clients are interested in, and also understand some of the challenges that the suppliers have in submitting those candidates to the client. One of the things that are part of the experience that clients have and a way to communicate back is related to, a very modern model of providing feedback scores. So as part of the assessments, not only do we assess the candidate abilities, which we'll get into, But we also obviously assess the service and other components of the supply chain and its ability to provide service to clients. So clients are constantly kind of looking at their supply chain, their suppliers, the candidates, the people that are helping them get this job done of acquiring a lot of, and also reacquiring them if that talent doesn't quite work out, and assessing their performance on the job and so on. So there's a lot of assessment going on here, which is, sort of what I want to get into a little bit more here. I'm working with two screens, so a little patience here. So let's take a look at the assessment side of it. As you see, we have a lot of candidates as we've identified. Oh, Jim's joining us. Hey, Jim.
Hey, the good news, welcome. Thanks for having me. The good news is I've heard everything you've said. I just couldn't log in. So you don't need to update me. I'm fully up to date.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Welcome. So big picture, taking a look at that again, where do we fit into this process? Obviously, you've got it from a client's perspective, you've got a lot of candidates that are being brought into the mix. There's usually in today's world some form of screening technology because the numbers of applicants and the possibilities, especially in an ever increasing larger global footprint for talent, is growing. So the pipeline is filled with a lot of potential. There's some form of screening tech, which we'll get into some of the fun developments today. And then from then on, we got a submitted or selected, lots of terminology for candidates that need further assessment. And that's where companies like Filtered, eTechie, and KarmaCheck get involved to find different ways with which to finally get to candidates that ultimately will be hired. So this is a little lay of the, as we progress that, as we talked about, this is how the panelists here today will be giving their views and thoughts on clients and client experience and how to improve that, given the world of assessment. And lastly, what I wanted to, before we jump into, to make it a little bit interesting, is that, we've heard a lot about AI and how AI is participating as a technology in what's going on here, especially as we focus today on the recruitment process and also this assessment process. In the screening component, which is where a lot of automation can be useful, in the last couple of months, I think most everyone has been hearing about some of the developments in AI, specifically around a new chat product from OpenAI by the name of ChatGPT. So I want to give you a little bit of sense on how this kind of comes into the mix of when we discuss this technologies and how it influences the way people are gathering some assessment. So as an experiment, sorry for bouncing around a little bit, there's a couple of developments here. I happen to have access to ChatGPT, pretty easy to do. And so actually what I did is I took a sort of sample, a query, where I asked in the voice and style of a technical recruiter, what are the top 3 questions I should ask someone applying for a job as a front-end open source developer? Limit it just to 3 questions. And as you can see, maybe not, it's a little small. The first set of answers came up with 3 questions. The second set of session is I basically took those 3 questions and I said in the voice and style of a candidate applying for a job as a front-end source developer, please answer the following questions. And got an answer back. So this is essentially ChatGPT being used on both ends of the recruitment process. The reason I put those 2 little rockets there is because in reality, what we've got with this sort of technology is kind of an arms race of those that are trying to beat the other side, if you'd say, in this process of figuring out that you are or you aren't who you say you are, and your abilities are or who aren't. So assessment is getting muddled by a lot of this technology being interjected. And if you use the tool yourself, with levels of sophistication that are added, the answers will become more sophisticated. So this is critical enough that a company like HackerRank that assists most specifically in code development, just 4 days ago published an article or published a page sort of addressing what is ChatGPT and what it does and what does it mean for technical hiring. So the bottom line here is in the world of determining, this talent and getting assessments done, there's a lot of technology being interjected that is making the job harder and more difficult to understand. And so if we look a little bit further as we progress this, because the point being that, and by the way, what I did is, this is a little sensitive here. I asked ChatGPT, top reasons a recruiter should assess their work candidates. And within a matter of seconds, they came up with this list of technical skills, experience. These are the things that recruiters should really sort of focus on and think about when they're requested to assess. It's a relatively complete list, obviously provided in a more sort of succinct manner. I was joking that it's did a faster, better job than I would have, just given that broad question base. And if we look at that and we obviously apply those things to a global footprint, another big development is that talent, especially in IT, can come from all around the world. So your clients do care about candidates, and they care about these things when assessment becomes part of the equation. And so we believe that it's a very important part of the experience that clients have. So sort of the framework of the type of conversation we're having here, I'd love to hear some more. I'm going to now stop sharing and maybe hear from Jim. Let's stop that sharing. Okay. Jim, you're pretty close to the clients, especially as a leader of MSP programs where you work with some pretty name brand companies, as they work with their supply chain of suppliers to find the right talent for critical jobs. What are your thoughts in terms of, how this assessment domain is being thought of by clients, the importance of it, and how it fits in, maybe as the closest to the representation of clients. And again, with all the breadth of clients that you've seen, maybe you can give us a summary and some thoughts about, what's critical to them, what's important, and how some of the developments that we've seen are, kind of affect that. You're mute.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think the main thing about my perspective is just framing it. And as you mentioned in the intro, we're primarily dealing with larger customers who are buying at volume in MSP and VMS-based programs. And so when you're dealing with high volumes in these MSP, VMS programs, everybody wants, kind of the easy button. They want everything to be available to them at their fingertips. They don't want to do anything outside the VMS because that's the system of record. They also don't want to pay for anything, the clients that is, that they don't have to. So you see all these issues kind of coming together. And to the extent a large MSP or VMS program is willing to use these kinds of assessments, and we actually just had one since you and I last talked, Hans, we did have a large client mandate it in their program. And that's the way they have to do it. Because if it's a competitive staffing program and if it's got a VMS platform, they essentially have to mandate it to all suppliers. Otherwise, it just creates craziness in general. Some suppliers will do it, some won't. People argue over who will pay for it, all that kind of stuff. Their margins have to support it. Their hiring volumes have to support it, and so on and so forth. A lot of this you can think of fairly intuitively if you just think of a big, massive staffing program that's all automated. And you just need everything to fit within that program. You need fair systems, processes, everything. So, the staffing suppliers generally have to pay for this, by the way. And then the margins of the program and the hiring volumes have to support it. As long as all that's in place, it can work. The problem is a lot of people who run these programs, it's just one more thing they have to do. And they're like, look, I've got my MSP, I've got my VMS. The MSP is supposed to be screening people, that's on them or whatever. And so they won't want to do that extra work. So I think it can work. Just in most of our programs, it's not mandated. So I don't really know to what extent different suppliers are using it. If they did, it would tend to maybe slow them down a little, and it would tend to increase their costs. And that may turn out to be a disadvantage to them in these high-speed, data-driven programs.
Right. Eric, any thoughts? I know you kind of represent a little bit more of the later stage assessment, where it's critical that the companies know who it is that they're engaging and hiring. And the staffing companies obviously don't want to take the risk of presenting candidates that are, problematic, eventually, kind of ruining their reputations and so on. So what are your thoughts in terms of, the areas of assessment that you think about relative to the client's experience and the client's interest in that?
Well, we, perhaps have a, slightly, easier task of, in the assessment area, and that we're, doing, background checks. And what that basically means is that we're checking for facts, right? We're not checking for more difficult things like, skills and that are maybe harder to, assess depending on the tests that are provided. So we're checking for facts, things like work history, employment history. In some cases, we're, having candidates by the nature of their employer, do, drug screens and things like that. So the fact that we're testing for facts makes it a little bit easier, but also is important nonetheless. In our area, the background check has basically been around for a long time, for decades, and is now really universally used in many different industries. And what we've been trying to do is to bring a better mousetrap to how this works and create some efficiencies there. And there, we do see, opportunities for how to make, this process go faster. We were talking about the contingent scenario, and as one of the aspects of that is that there's a high degree of velocity through that. People are onboarded, often that there may be churn as sort of inherent in that kind of activity, and so the need to keep on onboarding matters. And to the extent that employers are able to onboard and do background checks much more quickly, that actually is a net positive for them in their business.
Right. One other thing that I'd like to think about, obviously, we talked about programs that are higher volume and are more thought of as supply chains for some corporations that, spend hundreds of millions of dollars. If we look a little bit more at smaller companies or mid-market companies, how important is it? And perhaps staffing obviously is not as important as a full-time hire, but what's the level of frustration of the companies as obviously they're being asked to bring on employees that haven't perhaps been fully vetted relative to their skills and abilities? Jim, have you seen, levels of frustration or improvements that we can provide as a staffing group, staffing industry, staffing suppliers can provide to clients? Or is it, relatively irrelevant that, we just live with this sort of rate of ability to understand, someone's quality or ability to get the job done? Is it velocity overriding the need to kind of pay attention to that quality? Is it become critical for certain vendors, staffing vendors, to get that right better because they just don't want to have one of the candidates returned because of the fact that they just don't qualify? How does it affect the staffing supplier to get that, quality and assessment right so as to not have, downstream problems?
So there's a lot of issues going on in that question. I mean, again, I think in the context you asked the question, I think I can group the mid-market and the large market, broadly speaking, together. But, if you think about your typical hiring manager, whether mid-market or large market, one of the things they have to do, if they're going to use a test, they have to either choose what kind of a test they want to apply to the candidate, or maybe their staffing provider helps them with that. So then once they choose the test, assuming the test is accurate, they also need to review the results of the test and validate that they're not just taking, if the person scores an A, okay, I'm going to hire them. And if they score a C or a B, they're not. They have to review the results of that test. I would say the same thing about an online interview. They would have to probably watch the interview and make sure that they were comfortable with that person. So when your typical hiring manager thinks of those things as, okay, so first I got to pick the test, then I got to review the test, then I got to make sure the test was right. I think a lot of them just conclude, I'll just interview them myself, right? Because I know the questions I want to ask them about my environment. Now, the more commoditized the position is, and the more times they can use basically the same test all the time, then that equation gets a lot easier. So if I'm going to hire, 10 developers and they're all the same and I can use the same test, that's maybe a good investment of my time to compare those 10 developers on the same test without me having to individually do it. But when you get into these onesie, twosie hires or these more customized positions, it's probably more work to just figure out the test and review the test and then maybe have to use a different test if that test didn't work out. Plus you have the dynamic of the tests don't always reveal the best candidate. We've had that happen too. So when you bring all these issues together, and I know I've thrown a lot of things on the table, I think these tests and online assessments work much better at volume than they do in kind of the onesie, twosie, or the harder to fill position. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, so perhaps more breadth in terms of amortizing the investment across the larger, although, we
add one thing, because you asked about mid-market, right? There's your trick in the mid-market. You're going to have probably less volume in the mid-market in terms of, I may have a customer in the large market hire 10 developers, but in the mid-market, you may just need one. So I think when you're attacking the mid-market with this value proposition, it's less about, can you plug into the VMS and can you fully automate everything and all that? Whereas you're just trying to get the right test for the right person, for the right manager. When you get to the large market, it's much more about the connectivity to the systems and making it easy for the people and, storing the test in their systems so they can share it around with other people and things like that. So I think much like our business in general, a mid-market approach is going to differ from a large market approach in terms of some of the buying factors that the managers are going to look for, or the staffing firms for that matter.
Right. Yeah. And obviously in the market that we've just been in, mostly, I mean, I think we pendulum swung a little bit here. We had a lot of candidates that just would move on to an opportunity that wasn't testing them, right? Or didn't feel like it was something they needed to do. I think you've related that to me that, often, sending a link to someone and say, take this test was getting zero response because, frankly, they didn't take it seriously.
Right. Everything with staffing is about, it comes down to the program's reputation in the marketplace. So if I had a client, and we're about to have one, that mandates tests, and if you do well on those tests, if that translates into a job, the market will learn that information very quickly. Contractors will pass it around. It will become common knowledge fairly quickly. But if contractors start to feel like they're wasting their time on these tests, they just won't take them. The market for candidates is so hot right now, particularly in IT, and it's still hot. I mean, forget what you read about layoffs. Every talented IT person has multiple offers if they want it. They don't need to take these tests. Think of any hot market. If you're the person in demand or the thing that's in demand, you don't have to work as hard to get the attention. Now, if unemployment goes up, if jobs become harder to find, if we end up with a glut of software developers, which I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime, but then this dynamic could shift if it becomes harder to get a job. But right now, the talented people, there's experienced recruiters who know them, and they've got 2, 3, 4 offers if they want it, and they don't need to take a test. So that's another dynamic that you have impacting this market. It's not just the hiring manager, it's the candidate themselves.
Yeah, that's sort of a lot of what we've heard as well, especially in the more heated market segments, to a point where interviews have been, preferred, given the fact that an interview historically fits a lot more like a serious recruitment process. When you're getting interviewed face to face, both sides committed, it feels very much like you're on track. While, sometimes when being asked to take a test, you don't feel that same gravitas relative to the process.
I'm sure Eric would probably agree that in my experience, Eric, everyone requires at least background. Drug is somewhat changing, but you probably even see it in your business, right? If you have more and more people say, stop testing for drugs, which we see happening, then you have the candidates less interested in going through the process of taking a drug test because they're like, hey, all these other companies aren't checking it anymore. So in the past, you've benefited from, at least in our experience in the large market, a near 100% adoption of drug and background screening. The drug side is changing, and I bet you're seeing more candidates refuse the drug test now as well, would be my guess.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And those trends are really real. And, one of the things that we're noticing is that, in our area, you have this kind of menace of the kind of the virtual, work from home, remote work, set of interactions. The story I've heard a number of times now is that, there's a bunch of people, a bunch of developers that hire, and when in fact it's just one person, right? There's one person who's interviewing and getting multiple jobs, and they are, getting those assignments with the respective companies, and then they're dishing it out to their own people to, get that work, done. And there are scenarios like that where it's really hard to know, the identity of a person, nowadays when interview them remotely, even when you're working with them remotely. And those are the kinds of things that employers are trying to combat and to make sure that who they're getting is who they say they're really. So some new challenges in the space now.
Yeah, and that's really what I was sort of alluding to with all the ChatGPT conversation, that obviously artificial intelligence tools, and it will continue, are making it easier with which to sort of, let's kindly say it that, we obviously often in our interviewing as a service offering at eTechie, we catch fakes, people that are being interviewed that are saying they're one person or are able to do certain things. Clearly, they're not able to do that. And obviously, by having a live interview with an expert who is pretty expert at both interviewing and the subject matter, it's easier, let's say, to catch people that are at the very least embellishing sometimes. And they got statistics that, more than 3/4 of all this representation is embellished. And you, as the person who's ultimately going to work with individuals and are counting on them to, help you conclude projects and get things out on time, are going to suffer the consequences. The staffing companies don't necessarily carry that burden as much. I mean, they will if an individual fails miserably, but the people who obviously carry it even further downstream are the individuals that are relying on these teammates to kind of get the job done. All important stuff. Now, I have a question here about assessment replacing part of the hiring process that Eric said in. Is that a value? I'm going to read into something about that. I think, what we sort of envision is that, like we conduct interviews, we get an expert and we put them together with a candidate on behalf of someone who wants that candidate assessed. And it's video recorded and there's a scorecard and so on. But that's all something that the candidate is pretty happy with. We're looking in the future. And again, right now, it's a little bit more about the ownership of that content, if we call it that, and that's certified by a third party, like an e-techie company and the experts that we have on board, freelance experts that we use to kind of deliver these interviews. But that could be reused. I mean, you get a lot of learning from that interview session, and the candidates demonstrated their abilities to answer some difficult questions as proctored by a third party. So that could be reused and re-leveraged, and obviously it'd be just in time and whenever on demand. So we feel strongly that in the future, and in some cases already, that the clients would benefit as an experience, which is the core of what we're discussing here, by having those reusable assessments. Again, with velocity and other factors, dollars, as Jim identified, maybe that makes sense for even candidates to invest in. I know Eric had mentioned past when we met, that's starting to become more the case in the healthcare area, where nurses are getting a lot of these certifications checked and a lot of this material already available so they can move quickly. They can proactively submit them and say, you don't need to go check because here it is. It's already done. So I think that kind of answers the question that it is a value. It'll definitely expedite matters, but clearly it has to be sort of certified that it is, accurate and the assessment is unbiased. Obviously, we know in our industry, people often, have a vested interest in placing a candidate, quickly, as rapidly as. What else, Jim, do you see that is important to clients in this area, especially those that are working with staffing companies? What do they want to see? How do they get, I've always wondered this, how do they get confidence from a staffing supplier who obviously everyone claims to have, right candidate, the perfect candidate for the job, and maybe the best one in the market for the job. And clearly that's not possible for everyone. So how do they use assessments to kind of build that confidence with suppliers?
Yeah, again, a lot to unpack there. I guess what I would say is all these assessments, any type of assessment, and I would include drug and background in this comment, but testing, interviewing, drug background, anything, you always have to just consider it part of the overall process flow of your program. And whichever of these you're going to put in your program, the entire process flow has to be attractive enough, or it can't be too unattractive for the candidates to want to be a part of it. I think that's what everybody forgets in these things, is that we're so focused on what the client wants and the hiring manager wants and maybe what the staffing company wants. We forget that ultimately the candidate has to opt in to your process. And so the more things you put in your process, the less likely a candidate is to want to start that. But at the same time, if you have a very efficient process, then the candidates would say, well, I get a high ROI out of that. Maybe, for example, if passing a certain test advances them to the point where it's one test, 1 30-minute interview, and they get the job, that could be a very attractive process for a candidate. They could say, sign me up. But what we sometimes see is like, okay, take the test and then 3 more interviews. And the candidates are like, well, why bother? I don't want to go through that entire process. That's too cumbersome for me. So all of these tests have to be seen of as part of the entire process and with the candidate in mind. Now, to your other question, how do customers get comfortable with their staffing firm? The simple, honest answer to that, and it's not a great answer, it is trust over a long period of time. I was just talking to one of my vice presidents. He just got back from a big customer event. And he said, what's the most important thing to you? And they said, oh, that's easy. He went through all these. He said, it's none of the metrics. We don't care about the metrics. We care about trust. And they were serious. I mean, over time, staffing firms always prove themselves to their clients. The good ones prove that they're good. The bad ones prove that they're bad, and everything in between. So trust me, good staffing firms, we are not transaction oriented. We are relationship oriented. We are only as good as our last candidate. So if we're submitting people who either aren't good or aren't the person we said they were, or somebody else shows up at the job, or somebody takes 3 jobs that we put on site, that burns us. And so We do have a vested interest in all of that, but fraud and testing are kind of separate in many ways. You can have a great test result and still be the victim of fraud. So there's so many things that are involved in this, but the way we convince our customers that we know what we're doing is honestly through multiple transactions every day over multiple years, and hopefully never screwing them up. That's the hard part, because staffing is, as you know, there's always risk in staffing, but that's how you do it.
Yeah, I think it kind of wraps around back to that original sort of statement. It says that, everybody has, let's just say, pain points or complaints about the system, but everybody wants the truth out of it. They want the best result. They want to make sure that the candidate is the best fit for the job. And we obviously have to get to the bottom of that. And I think, interestingly enough here, clients are, driven by getting talent. They care about what the talent is experiencing, right? I mean, if the talent's not having a good experience in this process, they're going to shy away from it or go to someone else. And every client is in competition with every other client. The bottom line is all companies are going after this talent pool. So they want a fair, solid process that I think makes candidates happy. And so there's assessments on the candidate side about the process. Like you said, they really take a look at, what do I have to do to make sure that this happens in such a way that it's fair for me, it's fair for the client. It isn't just take, it's giving as well.
I think we oftentimes, go ahead, Eric.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that I think one of the, key metrics that staffing firms pay attention to is this kind of drop-off rate, right? Which is, when they are, recruiting candidates, to get them through the process, they would really like to minimize the rate at which, candidates drop off, or, they go to another firm, they have choices, that sort of thing. And so to the extent that experience, through that process is fast and convenient, well, that makes the staffing firm actually more efficient, more productive, especially after they've spent, many resources to attract candidates in the first place.
And
Right.
what I was going to add, Hans, is that sometimes I feel like the thing I have to be most careful of is this illusion of control. I tell customers all the time, we can design your staffing program to include whatever you want. We can hammer rates. We can implement testing. We can do all this for screening. We can multi-channel. We can do anything you want as a design principle. What we do not have control over, though, is how attractive the market finds your choices. Now, we have a lot of expertise around that, and we advise our customers and say, yeah, don't do this, do that. But if a customer ultimately wants to design their staffing program in a certain way, the vast majority of staffing companies, not all, but many, will sign the contract. But then the results that come out of that, if the changes they made were significant, could be very significant. Yeah, Eric, you just mentioned it, drop-offs, things like attrition, drop-offs, just the overall quality of the candidate, which is really hard to measure other than through surveys. Rates, you'll suddenly start receiving fewer candidates from your staffing suppliers. They'll start no-showing for interviews, or they'll complete the interview, but then they'll ghost you. There's so many different things that can happen in a staffing program when you start putting all these requirements on it. The best brand name employers have the most opportunity to have a rigorous process because candidates will put up with it because they want to work there. Employers without the great brand name have less of an opportunity to do that because candidates just won't put up with it. So this is such a dance between the candidate and the company and the hiring manager and the staffing firm. And it's trial and error, hundreds of placements a month, a year, whatever the size of the program. That's how you figure this out, is by just constant trial and error, and you see what you can get away with.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I saw it for a long time when we were implementing VMS-based programs. And it was one of the early taglines that said, this is just technology to try to make the process more efficient. And again, it's very analogous to other supply chain approaches. You have to respect the suppliers. Without them, you can't get your job done. You can't build a car without all of the suppliers that provide those parts. And so you can't give, this partnering, lip service. You need them, they need you. And ultimately, it's for the benefit of the candidates because everyone needs them to actually accomplish the job at hand. That will benefit all. So it's something, you're right, there's a balancing act here between good enough process to keep it true to what you're trying to achieve without it being so belaboring that makes it unattractive relative to other companies that are putting their supply chain processes together. So yeah, I appreciate. Thanks for highlighting the fact that it's not as simple as it might seem on the surface. There's quite a few collaborative moments here between, the management programs that you also perform as an MSP, the suppliers which fit into that program, and obviously the clients that are putting the list in place because they're putting money up to get all this work done, and that's really sort of where it begins. And then of course the whole supply chain and all the constituents participate to get and help that company get that work done.
I tell clients all the time that our industry is one of the few where the cost of goods sold actually have a brain and can decide if they want to be part of it, so
Yeah.
They can walk out the door anytime they want, and it makes our industry a different one.
No, and then I, working with Ariba a long time ago, introducing them to the services procurement world, they all don't fit in a catalog. They're not interchangeable, and there's more market dynamics. Today's price may fluctuate relative to tomorrow's price or even last year's price. So you add that additionally because it is somewhat of a commodity, not a commodity, a rare requirement based on what the market demands are. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting parts here. We obviously wanted to keep this assessment as the core and also connected to why it's important to the clients and how you can participate in making it easier for clients in terms of their experience with these complexities, especially one where it is difficult to kind of determine whether someone is capable of doing the job you're asking them, which obviously capable or available or some other factor that knocks them out, during the assessment. Well, we're getting to a point, I think, now where we're running out of time. I want to thank both of you. I'm sorry Dan didn't make it. I know he would have contributed a lot, being the ex-CEO of JobVite, an applicant tracking system, and in hot jobs. He's got a lot of experience also on the recruitment side of this and qualifying candidates. Let's wish him well in recovery. Hope he feels better. Well, at least by the time his 49ers play on Sunday. I'm sure he's excited and wants to see that. And thank you, Jim. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate your input. Thanks everyone else for attending as well. This will obviously be online, available for reviewing, and look forward to seeing everyone next year's World Staffing Summit. And I hope everyone out there enjoyed today's content here and for the rest of the summit. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Appreciate you having me. Nice to meet you, Eric.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.